Right, good afternoon. My name is Sultan Barakat. I'm the founding director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, which was established here at the Dukhan Institute now a little bit over 3 years ago. Before that, I was at the University of York in the UK for quite a long time, maybe 26 years or so, and I've just resigned my post from York and shifted my attention to Doha, hopefully permanently. I don't know how much information the school organizers gave you about what else is going on in the institution, but our center is one of those activities, and I have taken the liberty of circulating just one page summarizing our mission and one recent example of our engagement around issues of humanitarian diplomacy in Qatar and its intervention around the world. So those of you who are interested and you still have some time or before you leave, you'd like to come and talk to us, please feel free. Some of my colleagues are sitting around the room. But for this session, the focus of our attention is Dr. Haian Dukhan, and I have a real pleasure to act as a commentator, discussant for his paper. Haian is now based at Edinburgh University, where he teaches history. He's also an associate research fellow at the Center for Syrian Studies at the University of St. Andrews in the UK. And he's the author of State and the Tribes in Syria, which looks into the patterns of conflict and has just been published by Routledge in 2019. We will follow the pattern that you have followed over the last few days, which unfortunately I'm not familiar with, but I suspect it's the speaker presenting for about half an hour or so.
Yes, I'll be speaking for 20 minutes. I know everyone is quite tired, like as someone attending these sessions towards the end, so I'll be speaking for 20 minutes.
Right. Well, then I will come in and we'll raise some questions. Thank you so much. Please start.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the center for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to be with brilliant scholars working on the Middle East and other parts of the world as well. So this is a map of Hassaka. When the militarization of the Syrian uprising began, the Christians in the governorate of Hassaka found themselves in a contested region where the regime, Kurdish militias, and later the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, were vying for control. The disorder that resulted from these forces competing for power in the periphery of Syria subjected the Christian minority in Hassaka to a security dilemma, as the intentions of the opposition were not clear. This caused most of the Christians in the area to prefer the Syrian regime that had provided them with safety and protection for many decades. So what is it that I'm aiming to do in this paper? This paper attempts to analyze the factors that influence the position of the Christians in the governorate of Hassaka towards the Syrian opposition. In order to understand this position, this research will use the security dilemma theory adopted or adapted by Barry Posen. Barry Posen argues that when the state loses its control over certain territory, a security vacuum is created, forcing many groups, particularly minorities, to confront a dilemma regarding potential threats from other groups seeking control of their territories. So let's have a short background about the Christians in Hassaka and Christianity in general. Christianity is the second biggest religion in Syria, and the Christians were around 10% of the pre-war population. So the situation is quite different after the war. In Hassaka governorate, it's estimated that in 2012 there were around 250,000 Christians, so 250,000. However, the number significantly declined following the Syrian civil war. The Christians living in Hassaka have different ethnic backgrounds, so ethnicity is important here, and it's something I'm happy to talk about towards the end of this presentation. And these include Assyrian, Syriac, and Armenian. So while today Christian community in Hassaka are the direct result of the political events that shaped the region over the last 2 centuries, the history of these communities in Syria goes back at least a millennium. It's believed that the Assyrians were the first group to adopt Christianity as early as the 1st century. And I'm going to talk about why history matters here in terms of collective memory. Following the massacres against the Assyrians by the Mongol invasion in the 14th century, a very small population remained in the region until their recent return from Turkey and Syria. Therefore, the Christians in Al-Hassaka are in a unique position. While they are historically the indigenous people of Syria, many of their existing communities are the direct result of the recent political turbulence that shocked the region in the 19th and the 20th century. So, what is the argument of this paper, to start with, to summarize the argument? In this paper, I argue that the Christian community in Al-Hassaka has experienced a security dilemma due to uncertainty surrounding the intentions of the different actors in Syria. This made them more inclined towards the regime than the opposition. In his discussion of security dilemma, John Haars explained that fear of being attacked, subjugated, dominated, or annihilated drives certain groups to acquire power, which makes others feel more insecure and compels them as well in turn to prepare for the worst. The ongoing Syrian civil war in Syria and the withdrawal of the government from most of the northern eastern part of the country has exacerbated these security concerns. So the paper will utilize three aspects of the security dilemma in order to understand the position of the Christians in Al-Hassaka towards the Syrian uprising. First, structural factors, and then intangible factors, and then the role of agency. And I think there are some of you here who talked about the intangible factors. And yesterday, I guess, during the roundtable with Simon, we talked about agency and what we mean by agency here. First, the structural factors, which refer to shared historical experiences, played an important role in influencing the position of the Christians towards the opposition. Secondly, the intangible factors, which refer to the perception of the others. These also shaped the Christians' assessment of the opposition. Thirdly, the role of agency, which refers to some political actors taking deliberate actions that provoked fear among the Christians, which influenced their position towards the Syrian opposition. And I guess regarding the question whether history matters or not, we need to stress here that without the intervention of the political actors to exploit and revoke the security dilemma of the Christians, the structural and the intangible factors will mainly remain a collective memory that doesn't necessarily lead to any conflict. And this is where instrumentalism and the theory of instrumentalism would fit with this case study. So let's look at the structural factors. The structural factors that influence the security dilemma of the Christian in Al-Hassaka are related to historical legacies and the political realities in Syria today. The historical legacy of the Christians in Al-Hassaka is dominated by displacement and existential threats. One of the earliest experiences of threat is the expansion of the Muslim Arabs in Syria, and this is something that the Christians talk about up to now in Al-Hassaka. The Arab conquest were the first to shock the Christian communities, and they permanently changed Syria religiously and ethnically as well. This is very integral to the way that the Christians identify themselves as the indigenous people of Syria, and they sometimes view Arabs as culturally inferior invaders. And I'm going to start to cite some of the interviews that I did for this paper. In one interview with the Syriac youth from Al-Hassaka, the interviewee explained that the Syriac and the Assyrian communities were the founders of Syria, and that the Arabs of Syria were merely recent immigrants coming from the Arabian Peninsula. But this perception of originality amongst the Christians in Al-Hassaka does not hinder their awareness that their communities are the outcome of the dramatic events that took place in present-day Iraq and Turkey. The Assyrian Genocide, which probably has been present quite a lot in the news recently, also known as the Sefo massacres, played a major role in shaping the consciousness of these communities. It led to the largest wave of immigration to northeastern Syria. The Assyrian population living in northeastern Turkey were displaced by the Ottomans and other allied Muslim groups, including the Kurds, between 1914 and 1920. The Armenian Genocide as well massively increased Armenian immigration to Syria. Similarly, many Christians also immigrated to Syria following the Semil massacres in Iraq, which probably a lot of people don't know about, which killed as many as 3,000 people in 1933. And while I'm doing this research, I read a brilliant PhD dissertation written by Sida Altag done at the University of Utrecht, and the title of the dissertation was Sectarianism in the Syrian Jazeera, Community, Land and Violence in the Memories of World War I and the French Mandate. And she talks about the collective memory of the Christians in Al-Hassaka by saying that the indignation, the mournfulness, and the sadness evoked in the recollections of their pre-Syrian lives implied indifference and became the primary mode of identification in their relationship to other Christians and with non-Christians, including Kurds and Arabs. These historical events have created a communal identity that is susceptible to fear and existential threats, which are key for the birth of the security dilemma. But the recent developments in the region as well, such as the Iraq War in 2003, which, as we all know, threatened the Christian population with extinction, and the rise of Islamic extremism in Syria, have accentuated these structural factors of the security dilemma. In February 2015, I'm not sure if you read this in the news, but ISIS took control of 34 Assyrian villages, and hundreds of people were captured, leaving some Christian-dominated villages empty. After driving ISIS out of their villages, the Christians were struggling to trust their Arab Muslim neighbors. A local Assyrian person from one of these villages said that he no longer trusts the Arabs in the nearby villages, since he assumed they had helped the Islamic State. He said, in the old days we would see each other, and on the road we would greet each other. He said, now no one says anything. The effect of the opposition toleration of ISIS extremists bred fear and mistrust among the Christians about the intention of the Syrian opposition. These events have made many Christians concerned of the uncalculated political change promised by the Syrian uprising. The Syrian regime appeared to be the only viable protector of the basic cultural and the religious rights of the Christians, and the lesser of two evils as well. So in another interview for this paper, a former resident of Al-Hassaka commented that the most important thing for the Christians is self-preservation and not to be annihilated. So far, the cooperation with the government, according to him, has borne fruit as the Christians in these places continue to live and practice their religions as usual, the interviewee said. So despite some calls from some Christians to rely on the Kurds, since the regime military institutions in the eastern part of the country collapsed, there have been some calls to rely on the Kurds to provide them with the protection from ISIS. The massacres mentioned above render this dependence hard to swallow for some. Large number of Christians oppose cooperation with the Kurdish militias because they cannot forget that the Kurds perpetuated the Assyrian Genocide during the 19th and the 20th century. So in 2013, Christians started to distance themselves really from growing rapprochement with the Kurds by a small number of youths, and created a militia called the Sotoro, which announced its allegiance to the Syrian government. So let's move to the intangible factors. The other dimension of the security dilemma comes from the intangible factors, and these are mainly related to the perception of the others, which largely reflect how a community perceives itself. As previously mentioned, past experiences have made the Christian community perceive themselves as a threatened ethnic minority. The shared history of persecution provides this group with deep cultural and psychological roots, making religious identity extremely persistent. So the Assyrian and Syriac communities in Al-Hassaka perceive themselves as the indigenous peoples of Syria, as I just mentioned, who endure a hostile environment which threatens their heritage and population due to economic and political circumstances. Many Christian writers and commentators express these sentiments when they discuss the political situation in Syria. In an article, for example, written by Sulaiman Yusuf, who is a Syriac researcher and writer, he requested the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to implement his promises to the Christian community through changes in the Syrian constitution, and to guarantee the cultural rights of the Syriac community, and to separate the Islam from the state as well. Yusuf stressed the importance of the Assyrian era in the history of Syria, and he demanded the inclusion of the Syriac language in the official school curriculum. The letter also demonstrates the way that the culture of the Arab Muslim other is perceived. Yusuf considered the Arab Muslim presence in Syria to be relatively recent in the long history of the Assyrian civilization. He wrote in one of his articles, the civilization of Syria goes back more than 7,000 years ago, while the Arab Islamic presence started with the Islamic wars and the conquest that spread Islam 1,400 years ago. Many of those who were interviewed for this paper as well expressed their sorrow for the loss of the Christian population due to land reform measures and to adverse economic conditions, which stripped the Christians of their economic and social standing and forced them to emigrate from Syria from the 1960s onwards. The immigration of many Arabs to predominantly Christian cities and villages was also a point of regret for many residents as they viewed this as a threat to their existence. Phrases like Arab invaders or foreigners are often used to describe Arabs who immigrated to Christian-dominated areas or neighborhoods in Al-Hassaka region. One interviewee as well from the Syria community said, in many places in Al-Hassaka, Arab foreigners in Christian villages have changed the culture there irreversibly, which is a source of a great sorrow for us. We are the indigenous people of this land, and now we feel that we are strangers. Observing social media accounts as well of several Christian activists and news outlets from Al-Hassaka shows that there are many topics that feed into these concerns of the Christian community and its perceptions of the other in Syria. The first set of concerns is political. Many Syrian Christians express concerns about the rise of political Islam. Extremist Islamist groups within the rank of the opposition promise further Islamization and effectively threaten to treat religious minorities as second-class citizens. So they look as well as a speedy demographic change as Arabs move into historically Christian towns, the Arabs who were displaced as a result of the war. Despite its unplanned nature, this movement is perceived by many as demographic threat to decreasing Christian population and a potential security threat as ISIS and extremists, according to them, could infiltrate the displaced groups. And recently, of course, with Turkey invasion of northern Syria, and when I was trying to write this paper, reports of Turkey's intention to create a buffer zone in northern Syria to hold Syrian refugees, according to Turkey, have accentuated these anxieties and stressed the negative perception of Turkey and its allies within the Syrian opposition. Ibrahim Murad, for example, the head of the International Syriac Union, made a statement in January 2019 protesting the plans to replace American forces with their Turkish forces in northern Syria. Murad recalled the history of the massacres committed by the Ottoman Empire and condemned the actions of Turkey in Afrin in northwestern Syria. He said, according to him, Turkey threatens us every day through their media. They call us atheists. Turkey has committed genocides in Afrin when the West has allowed it to enter Afrin, forcing Christians to leave. The decision of Trump to leave Syria will leave us exposed to destruction by Turkey, and we know what it's like to live under the Ottoman Empire. We suffered from persecution and massacres, and we were treated as second-class citizens. And later on, what happened when Turkey started invading northern Syria, there were attacks against Christian areas and places of worship, and these have validated the fears of the Christians that their existence is threatened and that their religion is under attack. So I'm going to move to the last factor, which is the role of agency. And yesterday we discussed agency, and we had different definitions for agency. But in this context, agency, I use it to refer to deliberate strategic actions taken by the Syrian regime in order to exploit the structure and the intangible factors of the security dilemma for the Christians in Al-Hassaka, in order to persuade them to side with the regime. The Syrian regime has learned over more than 40 years in power to play the sectarian card, to play off various groups against each other in order to maintain its hegemony. Using its connections with Christian clerics, the Syrian regime continuously tried to revoke the historical fears of Turkey and its relationship with the Syrian opposition. At the same time, the regime figureheads and its media outlets repeatedly told the Christians in this region that they are the descendants of the original Syrian civilization, standing courageously with the Syrian government against barbaric extremist fighters. In his sermon, and here I'm going to quote as well some of the bishop and some of the religious figures in Al-Hassaka and Jazeera. In his sermon, Bishop Morris Amsih, the patriarch of Al-Jazeera, frequently talks about Turkey's role in supporting the Syrian opposition. He says that Turkey is trying to justify its support of the Islamist rebels in Al-Jazeera, thus repeating the history of genocide and annihilation against the Christian Armenians. Moreover, during his visit to Damascus, from Damascus to Al-Hassaka Governorate, Patriarch Mar Ignatius Ephraim, for this, I'm not going to probably go so much in detail about which church they represent, but they mainly from the Orthodox Church, convinced more than 100 Christian youths to carry arms and to join the regime-established militia called the Sotoro. Despite being heavily criticized for his actions, which, according to many, go against the basic principles of Christianity as a religion, the regime mouthpieces in Al-Hassaka, such as Nidaf al-Rahawi, justified this action by claiming that armed Christians would be able to stand against Turkish attempts to invade Al-Jazeera and to support Syrian Islamist rebels. He said, and to quote him again here, the blood that resulted from the Sayfo massacres, and this is how kind of all these memories are brought back by religious figures, the blood that resulted from the Sayfo massacres has not dried yet, and it's only the Syrian government that can prevent these massacres from happening again. In 2015, Christian militias of Sotoro was also seen fighting in the outskirts of the town of Sadad. So we started to see this militia moving from Al-Hassaka to the countryside of Homs, which is mainly inhabited by Christians. The town was under attack at that time by a group of Jabhat al-Nusra. Christian solidarity was evoked by the clergymen in order to convince members of the militia to defend their Christian fellows that are being exposed to similar existential threats. Through its media outlets, the regime officials, including Bashar al-Assad himself as well, frequently stated that the Christians in Al-Jazeera are not newcomers. So if you want to look at the expression here, according to al-Assad himself, Christians are the builders of the civilization that we have in this country. And to quote him again as well, he would say, their original roots are the reason why they stand with the Syrian government against the partition plots that the enemies of Syria are weaving against the country and against its religious diversity. Moreover, the regime's media outlets repeatedly compare the uprising that erupted in 2011 to the Muslim Brotherhood activities in the 1980s. The purpose of this was to convince the Christians that their only alternative would be Islamist extremists who would reject Christian existence and eliminate their freedom that they currently enjoy under the regime protection. Such statements repeatedly remind the Christian that the regime is their protector against barbaric medieval rebels who want to annihilate them, and to quote here the regime media. One of the interviewees stated that the Christians in Al-Hassaka are terrified of Islamist winter, which would bias them towards the current regime, as they view the alternative as uncertain, dangerous future under Islamists who only they have bitter memories of. So kind of they use always the word memory here, and the collective memories are quite present in what they say. On the eve of the Turkish invasion of northern Syria, Syrian state media started broadcasting interviews with a Christian priest from Al-Hassaka. In one of the interviews, priest Bahnan Hando says it was our ancestors who fled from the Turkish genocide to Syria. We, the grandchildren of the survivors, are at the risk of reliving a genocide that our ancestors told us repeatedly throughout the generations, a genocide that will be perpetuated by the same oppressor, which is in this case Turkey. Other Christian activists announced their full rejection of Turkish invasion as well, and asked the Kurdish militias to allow the Syrian state to come back and regain full control of their territories before Islamist militias supported by Turkey attempt to do so, according to them. One of the other techniques that the Syrian regime as well employed in order to raise the fear among the Christians, and some would use actually the term Islamize the Syrian uprising, was releasing Islamist prisoners from Sinai prison in the early phase of the protest. These releases helped reactivate the Islamist groups that were lying dormant in the country. By releasing Islamist prisoners and tolerating their rise to power, the regime reinforced the fears of the Christians to win their backing in its fight for survival. So, to conclude, the security dilemma put the Christians in Al-Hassaka governorate in a critical position at the beginning of the Syrian uprising. This made them more inclined towards the Syrian regime than the opposition. During the early phase of the uprising, only a small number of Christian youth took part in the protest movement against the regime. So that doesn't mean that the Christians did not take part in the protest movement in Al-Hassaka. But if we want to look at the public opinion, the clerics and the intellectuals among the Christians, they were mainly reserved in declaring a clear position towards the Syrian uprising. The experiences of the Christians in the region, following the historical displacement that their ancestors suffered from at the hands of Islamist governments and groups in Turkey and Iraq in the early 20th century, and the collapse of the Iraqi state following the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the sectarian violence as well that followed this invasion that haunted the Christians, made the Christians in Al-Hassaka more concerned about the consequences should the Syrian regime institutions crumble in the region. The intangible factors, which I refer to here as the perceptions that the Christians have of the opposition as Islamist-dominated groups keen on curtailing their rights and treating them as second-class citizens, made the Christians in Al-Hassaka decide to be faithful to the regime. But then here as well, the regime role could not be ignored. Benefiting from these two set of factors, the regime provoked these fears using its connections with religious clerics and media outlets to inspire the Christians' loyalty and to encourage them to join some of its military units that it formed in the governorate of Al-Hassaka. As the Syrian uprising turned into a civil war, the fear among the Christians became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The Syrian regime military capacity in the periphery has decreased. Islamist groups such as ISIS benefited from the vacuum and occupied many Christian villages in Al-Hassaka. They kidnapped hundreds of Christians and held them to ransom. After driving ISIS out of Al-Hassaka, most of the region fell under the control of what we call Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, which is a Kurdish militia, as I just mentioned. And this militia managed to convince some Christians to join its ranks. So there has been a small number of Christians who joined SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces militias. But the reality on the ground seems to be that the majority of the Christians prefer the return of the regime control to their regions because for them, the regime will be the guarantor of their safety from what they consider an Islamist-dominated opposition and potential Turkish attempts to take over their territories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haian. And I really enjoyed reading this paper, and it helped me understand much better what was going on in an area that I think probably one of the most complex areas in Syria, and if anything represents the overall Syrian conflict in a micro way. There are a couple of issues that have come to my mind as I was reading through yours, and I'd like to start with the most theoretical, and that is, why did you choose this particular model, the Barry-Posen model of looking at security dilemma? And then when you've chosen it, as you go through your paper, you seem to emphasize under the structural, mostly historical. When, at least in the field I come from, we work on conflict analysis and so on, we look and we give quite a good attention to the economic aspect. Mm-hmm. And one of the dilemmas here is that Hassaka was one of the poorest before the war. So the Syrians, the assumption is that they were trapped in an underdeveloped area, which means that if they had grievances, if there were to be any grievances, Hassaka should be at the forefront of those against the regime and the many years and so on. But that did not materialize, and it'd be interesting to see whether that particular model has helped you elaborate what I think is a very interesting discussion here. So maybe we'll start with this one. I have a few others.
Okay. I guess when it comes to security dilemma in general is used in international relations to refer to, like, I would say, the connection between states. Barry-Posen probably seems to be the first who would use that in ethnic terms, really. And that's why I'm using Barry-Posen here. I guess when it comes to the economics, I put that like somewhere in the paper. about I talk about the land reform measures that stripped and the economic conditions as well that forced many Christians to immigrate. And I guess that wasn't necessarily only the case of Syrians. I guess the immigration of Christians, the immigration out of Syria for economic reasons was for probably all sorts of Syrian communities in general, whether they were Sunni or Christians. And I think your point about the economic factor is valid. Probably I need kind of to stress it out and make it clearer. It's just kind of really picking this side of the argument that relates to the security dilemma. Yes.
I mean, to tell you what I think of the security dilemma, I think it has two problems. One is that it gives you the impression that the subject that you're studying is an innocent, independent third party to the problem.
Mm-hmm.
They've not contributed to the development of the situation where you reached or that triggered the conflict in the first place, which in some communities in the Middle East, and maybe to some extent the Christians, we'll come back to the issue of how we define Christians,
of course,
but
yes.
they played an important role in shoring up the regime, the Ba'ath regime, the ideology, a lot of our Arab nationalists, Baathists, etc., because in their own mind, some would argue that they saw this as a way to protect themselves in a majority Muslim community. So that's one aspect, I think, of this. And the other, the assumption that state fragility will always expose minorities to a greater insecurity. That may work in different contexts. I think in the Middle East it's slightly maybe the other way around, because the regimes that were set up were largely a collection of aligned ideologies and so on. But one suggestion would be maybe to try and look, and part of this, maybe part of your conclusion could be a critical reflection on the method, on the framework itself, in the context of what works and doesn't work within the Middle East, within Syria, within this particular case study. The second issue, which we started maybe discussing, and I'm sure you've probably talked about it given the sectarian title for the school. When you talk about a group like Christians, you lump them all together, and this paper kind of lumps the whole lot as Christians in Syria. Maybe you have the advantage of focusing specifically on a district or a semi-area governorate of Hassaka. But within the Christians of Syria, out of that population, which according to your papers 10 to 12%, did they all fall under this broad umbrella? The vast majority went through this sort of mainstream of standing, say, by the regime, or did they fracture? Did they have different representation, and in what way?
Okay. I guess if I want to start with the last question, yes, I would say probably they all fall under this umbrella more or less. But there are different factors here. I guess the reason why I chose the case of Al-Hassaka is because I am interested in peripheral communities. I mean, considering my past research on the tribes in Syria, I'm mainly interested and my past work experience, I'm interested in the rural areas of Syria, in the periphery, let's say, and that's why I chose the case of Al-Hassaka. And I think there has been probably so much done on the Christians as well in other parts of Syria, like in Homs and Damascus, but not so much done on Al-Hassaka. But I would say that there are a lot of similarities when it comes to their position from the Syrian uprising. So this is something that could be generalized, of course. And I have looked actually at literature as well that looked at the kind of the involvement of the Christians in the Syrian uprising and their position towards the Syrian uprising, and I benefited from it in terms of looking at the role of the Christians. But what makes the Christians' position in Al-Hassaka unique is the ethnic background, the fact that they are not Arabs really, while the rest of the Christians in Syria, well, they consider themselves Arabs. I'm not sure, there is a lot of debate about these things anyway, but the people here clearly identify themselves within different ethnic background, Syriac and Assyrian and Armenian, and they talk so much as well about the genocide that happened in the 20th century, and then later on the fact that the regime has withdrawn from these areas, the fact that ISIS has taken control of their villages. So there are a lot of kind of differences as well, if we want to talk about, and the role of Turkish invasion of northern Syria, of that part of the country, make the the case of Al-Hassaka a unique one, let's say, more or less. I guess when it comes to the theory, yeah, I mean, this is like a paper that is still under, actually it's under review. So let's see what the reviewers would say about the theory. I mean, they might reject it. This might be like really like good feedback to start considering other theories. I guess when it comes to this, but this has been part of two years project at St. Andrews University, funded by the Danish Research Council, and the first paper looked at sectarian mobilization in Deir ez-Zor. So there's some sort of continuity here in terms of looking, and you could see where Deir ez-Zor at the map is Deir ez-Zor, and in Deir ez-Zor there is a completely different dynamic there. We don't talk about Christians in Deir ez-Zor, we talked about Shia, Sunni divide, but anyway, I guess that's drifting away from the comments. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Sorry, let me just finish a few points and then I'll open the discussion. I spent the whole night reading it last night. I really enjoyed it. So I'm going to get all off my chest, and then I'll let you.
Thank you.
The difficulty, I think, is that by presenting them as an innocent party to the conflict that found themselves, you start your paper by saying they found themselves in this sort of thing. You open yourself for critique and criticism from other sides, especially that in the paper you don't mention that they have evolved with the conflict and they've developed their own militant groups.
Sure.
And they've carried arms like everybody else, and they have reached the conclusion, like any other minority in the country, that you have to defend yourself by violence.
Sure.
Now, they may not have been as effective as others, but they reached that conclusion.
Yes.
And the next point, which is also related to this model, the way it leads you into a certain way, you don't at all acknowledge any links outside Syria with the groups. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if it existed, but in Iraq, for example, part of the problem of why the Christians became the target very early on in the war after Saddam Hussein is that all these groups from the United States, particularly the, what do you call them, born-again Christian evangelicals, were rushed into contact with these people. They're going to save them. They're going to make them much better, and so on. And they built very much on the rhetoric of that history, that we are the indigenous people of this land.
Yes.
Those people came across to us. And that's another dangerous assumption. And the third, and this is maybe a question, why do you think they fear the Arabs more than they fear the Kurds? I mean, the Hassaka sits like halfway, and it has the river running across.
Yes.
They don't seem to be phased out by the spread of Kurdish power in the region, but they are, as you rightly describe here, panicking when they see the Arabs coming in, even if they were displaced Arabs who are really had a hard time elsewhere.
Yes. Are they innocent? I guess the question, are they innocent? Yes, they carried arms, very small number who carried arms. The majority of them decided to leave. They didn't want to carry arms, actually. And there have been like a lot of criticism from many groups towards carrying arms. And I guess carrying arms has come more as part of the regime attempts to manipulate and to try to get some sort of manpower in an area where the regime is struggling with shortage of manpower. So are they innocent? I would say to that question, yes, they are. And did they carry arms? Yes, a very small number encouraged by the regime. They found themselves, I guess, maybe they were dissatisfied with the economic situation. There has been migration out of Syria, but they didn't want to change to happen in this way, in this dramatic way in terms of, let's say, this fierce military change. So that's kind of in terms of the first question. Why would they fear the Arabs more than the Kurds? I guess in terms of there have been calls, I mentioned like in the paper, by some of the Christians to stop cooperating with the Kurds. They have been asking the Kurds to allow the Syrian regime or the Syrian government institutions to come back to their regions. But I guess if you have probably the lesser of two evils, the Kurds or the Islamists, then of course you are going to choose the Kurds. And for them, I mean, the Kurds are not having this fight on their own. They are part of an international coalition. Actually, on the other, to the opposite of what I just mentioned, the Kurds want to appear as they are the protector of the minorities in the eyes of the international community in the war against ISIS. And that's why probably the Christians would feel that they are safer with the Kurds than they are with the Muslims or the Arabs, let's say. Yeah.
And finally, I think in terms of agency, I really loved your analysis of this. The only thing I take against it is that it takes Assad only as the one
Yes.
agent
Yes.
that has tried to work with this community, either attract them or not. I don't know, but I suspect there will be others, because the
Yes.
wisdom tells you that if your enemy is trying to get closer to one community, you should also try and do the same.
Yes.
And it would be interesting to hear more about this. But also in terms of Assad, I think you need to be careful maybe not to overplay the role, in the sense that why would Assad bother so much about 10% of the population who, as we had agreed, many of them were living in rural areas that are deprived, they're not necessarily rich, it's not industrial, they don't sit on resources. Was he just, it's not about numbers, clearly. So maybe it is about him presenting himself to the world,
Sure.
and strengthening that stereotype that this is Assad defending against the extremist,
Yes.
and as such this minority is important to him.
I guess it's probably a twofold aspect, really. One of them is international legitimacy, of course. The regime has always tried to show itself as a protector of minorities. So to kind of, the legitimacy factor is very important when it comes to this. And the regime has always announced in more than one occasion that it wants to gain full control of the whole country, that it is going to regain sovereignty over Syrian territories. While it was busy to start with, probably with protecting Damascus and other part of the country, the regime had an eye on Al-Hassaka and Deir ez-Zor, that yes, we need to have a card there, we need to show that we are protectors of this minority. And that what the regime succeeded in a way or another in doing. Now with the regime more or less is back to large part of Al-Hassaka now. And the Christian, there are some probably, we're going to talk about the ethnic factor here, like ethnicity. There are some activists from the Syriac community who are against the regime, who criticize the regime, who are concerned about their safety now when the regime is back. But in general, like the general atmosphere or the general mood among the Christians wants the regime to go back to these regions. I guess agency, have there been other parties that wanted to instrumentalize the Christians as well in Hassaka apart from the regime? Yes, the Kurds have been trying to do that as well. They try to show themselves as the protectors of the minorities. I mean, they've been through their media outlets trying to interview the Christians and probably talk about the diversity, the religious diversity that they are enjoying under the rule of SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces. So it's been done from the Kurdish side as well, but probably more, I would say, like the regime has been more successful in doing it than the Kurdish have been. Yeah.
And really final one. In terms of your sample that you interviewed, you don't explain how and why you've chosen these particular individuals. Is the assumption that there is a think tank, there's a think group of Christians who are kind of considering options? When you say the majority are happy to go back to Assad, are they happy to go back to Assad as he was in 2010? Or are they requesting or demanding a reformed Assad of 2019? Or what is...
So I conducted about 15 interviews for this. I didn't go to the field. I didn't go to Al-Hassaka, obviously. Like it's a very dangerous place to go to. Like most of them have been over Skype with people who are in Al-Hassaka itself or in the UK or in other parts of the world as well. And out of 15, I would say probably, that's why when I said the majority, out of 15, they were like, I would say 12 people really who were saying that we prefer the return of the regime, we prefer the return of the Syrian state to our region. Sorry, what was the second part of the question?
Do they refer, they say we prefer the return as they knew it in 2011? Okay. Or
I guess for them now it's just safety, really, that's what really matters.
Right.
A strong state that would prevent the rise of ISIS again in the region, that would prevent ISIS from taking over their villages as it did in 2014.
Sure.
That's what really matters at this stage, yes.
Great, thank you so much. We'll open the floor for discussion. Start with